I think I've said many times that I'm a trustee of a church in Bolton called All Souls, and it's an Anglican church that was shut for 26 years. 10 years ago it was decided to reopen it, but as a community and a heritage centre, and thanks to the Heritage Lottery Fund, £4.5 million, the job is now complete. And also along the road was another development of a brand new Muslim boys' school, the Eden School. And because we're so close to them, the RE teacher at the school called him one day and said, could she bring a group of boys around to show them this church? And she said, because they're doing RE as part of their comparative religion studies. So somehow or other, the staff at our place volunteered me to give this talk to these Muslim boys. And we were pleased about this because this church is in the middle of a very deprived area, and most of the housing immediately around it is occupied by Muslim families. And we had a lot of problems initially because they thought the building was just going to be for them, it was going to be their community centre, and they could have all sorts of Muslim practices. They wanted to divide it into men and women and things like this. And they got very uppity with us when we applied for an entertainment licence, which included serving alcohol. So we were pleased. And then the teachers came round to say what this group of boys, and actually it wasn't one group of boys, it was 6 groups of boys. It was the whole of year 9 and year 10. And I found I'd been volunteered to take each of these groups for an hour each. And I had 2 groups on the Wednesday, and I had 4 groups on the Thursday, and the first group meeting at 8 o'clock in the morning. The 8 o'clock in the morning group were very, very passive and very, very sleepy. And apparently they start early so they can finish early on a Friday afternoon. The group after lunch were were high on E numbers, so they were quite a lively group. But I thought I based the talk on comparing worship in the mosque with worship in an Anglican church. I didn't say I was a Unitarian, I said this is an Anglican church and this is how things would be in this church. And I asked them how the imam is chosen in the mosque. And they said, the imam is chosen by the congregation, who's one of the scholars. So they choose the best scholar to be their imam. And I told them, the vicar of this church, which was the Church of England, would have been chosen by the bishop and licensed by the Queen. And that the vicar could have the freehold of that church. And I said to them, if the imam's no good, the congregation can sack him. But if the vicar has the freehold of the church, no one can sack him. And if the congregation goes down to 10, well, to him it doesn't really matter. And I told them said if they got a £1 coin out of their pockets, they would see that the Queen was the defender of faith. And we talked about Prince Charles wanting to be the defender of all faith, but the Queen is the defender of the Christian faith in this country. And we talked about how the vicar is ordained by a bishop, who was ordained by a bishop before him, and this goes all the way back, supposedly, to Peter in Rome. And he blessed the first bishops, and so it spread out, and this rite of apostolic succession goes on. And even some Unitarian ministers like to be ordained, but it's absolutely meaningless, because the chain was broken when Henry VIII broke away from Rome. So no Roman Catholic bishop ever blessed an Anglican priest. So the succession was broken there. And it was a big problem when the Methodists and the Church of England were talking about combining. because up came this issue of apostolic succession, and he said to the Methodists, actually, you're not proper ministers or priests because you've not had the hand treatment. And then we compare that to Muslims. When they go to Mecca and they walk around the Kaaba on their pilgrimage, they have to walk around the Kaaba, the big black box, 7 times. But set in that box is a stone, and this stone was apparently was kissed by Muhammad, and so all the people who go there would like to be able to kiss the stone themselves. So they kiss the stone that Muhammad kissed, but those who can't get near to it, every time they go around, they just point at it, and it's apparently the bottom left-hand corner. And so I said, where does this stone come from? And they said it was built by Abraham and Ishmael, and the stone was given to Ishmael by Gabriel, and it came from heaven, and it came from God's temple in heaven. And this Kaaba, this big black box in Mecca, they said is a copy of it. And so we talked about our versions of Ishmael, because in the Old Testament, Ishmael is the son of Hagar, who is a slave girl who belonged to Abraham. And Abraham's wife Sarah he wasn't into communal marriage, so she asked for Hagar to be slung out. So Hagar and her son Ishmael were slung out and wandered off in the desert, and the story goes he ended up in Saudi Arabia, and he founded his church there. But the Muslims said he was with Abraham when they built this, and they built it with Gabriel's help and God's help. And then we talked about the scriptures, because in the mosque they have the Quran, and the Quran came with Muhammad, and he said it was dictated to him by Gabriel. It was written in heaven and dictated to him by Gabriel, and we compared that to what the Church of England vicar would have. He would have, principally, he'd have the prayer book, because the Church of England vicars have to follow the Book of Common Prayer with all their services. And I said to them, on this next Sunday, whatever it would be the 15th Sunday after Advent or something, and these are the prayers, and these are the collects, and these are the psalms that all have to be done on this day. So it follows a rote. And this prayer book really came into being in 1600 and something, based on the old Sarah prayer book. And the Bible, the vicar uses the Bible, but the Bible did not come with Jesus. The Bible came some 300 years after the life of Jesus, when there was a bishop, Alexander of Alexandria, who decided this is what the Bible will contain, because there was so many versions of going around. All the letters of the apostles, accounts from different apostles, Thomas, Andrew, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, all going around, various letters going around, and Alexander of Alexandria said, these are what we're going to have in our Bible. These 4 Gospels only, and these letters of Paul and John and Timothy. Keep out all the Gnostic stuff, was one thing he did. So the Bible was the composite, but 300 years after the life of Jesus. And the other thing we talked about was the language. As I said, originally the Bible was written in Latin, and the Old Testament was put together years later afterwards, because of Christianity. The Jewish community set the Old Testament to Septuagint. The 60 scholars decided what was going to be in the Old Testament and what was not. A good example of what was not was the Book of Enoch. That was thrown out. Enoch and his journey to heaven, like Muhammad had. the scripture in the mosque is read in Arabic. The Quran is written in Arabic, and the Imam will deliver his sermon, read from the Quran in Arabic, and he will give a sermon in Arabic. And the teacher said, well, now they're drifting away from that, because most of the people, only the scholars learn the Arabic, so they tend now, they started off doing Arabic and English, and now most of them just do English. And I said to them, well, in Christianity, once upon a time, the Bible was in Latin, everything was in Latin, and people really just, you sort of learnt the music of it rather than the actual meaning of what was going on. They'd go to a service and follow the Latin script or just hear it. And what used to help them were the stories which were set in the windows, the stained glass windows. So we talked about those and how in the mosque, of course, they don't have painting. They just have a very fancy form of calligraphy, verses from the Quran written in classical Arabic. And I asked them, if you could go can you go into any mosque and it'll always be the same, Friday prayers will always be the same? And they all said, absolutely, yes. I said, that's how the Christian church used to be, when it was really the Catholic Church, and everything was in Latin. But some years ago, when I was with the Interfaith Council, we had a meeting, a gathering, and we said, why are there so many churches in Bolton? And why are there so many mosques, 23 at the moment? Why are there so many temples? 6 at the moment. And the Muslims who came found it very difficult to understand about why we had so many churches, why the Christian church had fragmented into, like in Bolton, there's about 40 different ones. But they said, no, the mosque, every mosque is the same. But the Imam, my friend who came to talk, said, actually that's not true. He said, because all the different mosques are built for people from different areas of India and Pakistan, and they bring cultural differences with them as well, and different understandings. And he said, if I stood up and said, the mosque on Dean Road is slightly different from the mosque on Halliwell Road because this, that and the other, so they'd end up arguing and they could end up fighting. So I'm just going to say, yes, they're all the same and you can go from one to the other. But one of the things we had to deal with Interfaith Council was a Pakistani man who complained that he was not allowed to go in, he was a Pakistani Muslim, was not allowed to go into the Indian mosque. I don't know what became of that. And I showed them, in this church of ours, set behind the altar are carvings. It's carvings of the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments, and the Apostles' Creed. And they all had a look at these kids and said that this Apostles' Creed was the statement of faith of the Christian church. And people had to believe that. They had to stand up and say this every Sunday, whether they said it in Latin or whether they said it in English. And if you didn't say that, then you weren't actually a Christian. And they really do the Allah Akbar thing where God is great. That's their statement of faith. And then we talked about the Reformation. And they would say there's never been a Reformation in Islam. So we chose not to talk about Sufis and others, and we left that alone. But I came to tell them about how about the Reformation, and I used to tease these kids because I would say to them, the way it used to work was this, that I could say to you, give me £100 and you won't have to go to hell and you won't have to go to purgatory. Help me build my church and you won't have to go to purgatory, you can go straight to heaven. And it was against that background that the church broke up and we had the Reformation. They found it a bit hard to believe because but these boys are all year 9 and 10, 14, 15-year-olds. They're all quite bright, quite interested. We had a discussion too on our burial customs, because in the Muslim faith, when you die, you should be buried the same day, within 24 hours. A big problem in Bolton when, if someone dies, then there has to be a post-mortem, because they say, we want the person buried within 24 hours. And they have a system where they use the MRI scanners in Bolton hospitals overnight to do MRI post-mortems. And I said to them, and our custom of waiting 3 days is connected with the crucifixion and the resurrection, that the body of Jesus lay in the tomb for 3 days. Therefore, when a Christian dies, they're left for 3 days to follow this path of Jesus. But they had no problem with the idea of resurrection because they believed in it themselves. Because they say a Muslim lives his life with two angels. One is recording his good deeds, and the other is recording the bad deeds. And when your spirit is released and you go to heaven, they present their reports. And hopefully the good deeds will outweigh the bad deeds. They accept the miraculous stories. They're quite happy with yes, Muhammad was taken by the angel Gabriel to Jerusalem and shown Jerusalem, and yes, the Quran came from Gabriel, and the stone in the mosque, that came from Gabriel too. And I told them about the Trinity. I said, it's something you can't explain. It has to be accepted as an act of faith. And they're all very puzzled by it, and I said, well, I am too. But it's just one of those things. And I was talking to the teacher afterwards. It amazed me, these young female Muslim teachers with these great crowds of lads, and they had them just like that under control. Boys, but they all stopped. Wonderful, I could never do that. But I was talking to the teacher afterwards. I'd given my talk on as if I was an Anglican vicar. I said, well, actually I was a Unitarian minister. And she was talking about this Trinity thing, and I was saying that, well, we use reason to interpret the Bible, and we see Jesus as really a special man, a holy man, but not part of any Trinity. And that's the way we read the Bible. And she looked at me with a feeling of sort of pity. And I can understand why in a way. Because the German theologian Schleiermacher wrote that faith has to be wrapped up in poetry and legend. And he decried anyone who just used what he called arid reason for interpreting scripture or for following a faith. And he said, if you read the Bible or the Quran only with arid reason, it very quickly becomes unbelievable. And the sayings of Jesus are not going to be very different from the sayings of anyone else, Deepak Chopra or anyone else. They all say the same things, don't they, about how to live our lives based on the life of love. But when those teachings become wrapped up in legend and mystery, they then take on a sort of timeless quality. And of course, we Unitarians pride ourselves on our reason, and we say, well, we've managed to cut the chaff away from the Christian teachings. Because when we do that, of course, the facts won't add up. When I gave a talk to the Theosophical Society in Bolton about the Rosicrucians. Anyone know Rosicrucians? No?
I know of them.
You know of them? Well, when I was researching my talk on the Rosicrucians, it said it all came from a story that wasn't true about this this man who had this vision and this understanding which had been carried through the generations from ancient Egyptian times. And they wrapped this story up in a form of legend, and they added a good dollop of mystery to it. And because they wrote it that way and presented it that way, people absolutely refused not to believe it. And the more they said, actually, it's not actually true, they said, yes, it is, because look, it goes all the way back to the ancient Egyptians and even as far as Atlantis. But they had actually made it up, but based it on old teachings. So when you think about it, all religions have their origins in mystery, and we buy into that mystery and we buy into the legends of something. And you wonder sometimes if as Unitarians we've sacrificed something of our religion by going down the path of arid reason. See, why shouldn't we keep the poetry and the legends and the mystery of faith and enjoy them? And even though they're not true, say, ah, yeah, but they might have been. And it could have happened, and it gives a sort of essence to the stories. So we don't have to accept that everything we read is definitely historically true. Just that it's a good story and there's a truth in it. And it's only by looking into the story or behind the story, it's telling you something which is ageless. And somehow, because you have to study it, the truth is better because you've discovered it. And after all, there's a part of life which is a mystery. See, the deeper we look at anything, the more we discover. The element of mystery is always there, wherever we look. And I like to think of Christianity, I don't follow the creed, so I'm not a card-carrying Christian. But I do think of it as a kind of mystery religion. So much about it is not known. So much can be discovered about it. Some of its truth can be found in the scriptures. Some of its truth can be found in the scriptures which were not allowed into that one after 300 years. The Gospel of Thomas being a very good example. But we find more by probing the mystery rather than trying to strip it away with arid reason. As we say, the Bible is not a single book, but a collection of books. Mystery writings about a man who came from God with a teaching about truth and love and then returned to God again. That's how I see it. And the stories are set in a place and a time that could be anywhere. The stories are set in a time of hypocrisy, a time of racism, a time of cruelty, a time of injustice. And we could apply that same story to any country at any time, even in today's time and today's world.